What if World War I never happened? Picture a Europe without trenches, no barbed wire soaked in rain and fear, no endless lines of boys marching into guns older than their general's imagination. The lamps of Europe never go out. The summer of 1914 fades into autumn, and the trains keep running to work, to school, to lovers. A single bullet never shatters a continent, and suddenly the 20th century bends. Let's anchor ourselves in the world that really was. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. A newspaper delivery boy with a pistol, a wrong turn by a royal motorcade, and the heir to an empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is shot. The fuse hisses into the powder keg of alliances. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia. Russia mobilizes for Serbia. Germany backs Austria. France backs Russia. Britain watches the dominoes topple and steps in. What was supposed to be quick becomes hell stretched in mud. 4 empires collapse. German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian. A plague, the 1918 flu, rides the troopships and kills more than the war. Versailles punishes Germany, resentment festers, and a failed painter finds a podium. Another war swallows the first. The atomic age is born in fear. The Cold War splits the planet. Decolonization ripples across Africa and Asia, and the map we know, our modern map, snaps into place. Now, flip the coin. The what if is simple. The assassination fails. Or more precisely, the crisis is cooled. Maybe the Archduke's driver doesn't make that fateful wrong turn. Maybe the pistol jams. Maybe Franz Ferdinand lives, not as a martyr, but as a reformer. The summer hums, tense, but unbroken. What happens then? Franz Ferdinand was no gentle dove, but he was a planner. He distrusted the Hungarian nobility, distrusted Vienna's inertia, and he dreamed of restructuring the Austro-Hungarian Empire into something more flexible, a federation of equal nations under the Habsburg crown. In our timeline, he never got the chance. In this one, he does. The old Emperor Franz Joseph dies in 1916, as he did historically. The Archduke becomes emperor, and the empire that was a patchwork quilt with fraying seams tries something radical, stitching the seams tighter with new patterns. Call it the United States of the Danube. Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes, Poles in Galicia, Romanians in Transylvania. Each gains wider self-government, a flag, a budget, a voice. Budapest resists. Vienna fumes, but the compromise holds, barely. Why? Because the alternative is chaos, and everyone remembers how close they came to war in 1914. The Black Hand is hunted down, the conspiracy stampede breaks, and Serbian nationalism, still fierce, now contends with a more open door to Slavic leadership inside a reformed Habsburg world. With no great war, Germany remains an empire too, a constitutional monarchy with swagger. The Kaiser is still theatrical, but the real power slowly tilts to the Reichstag and the industrialists. The Navy rivalry with Britain continues, but it is a race measured in budgets and shipyards, not blood on the North Sea. Without the shock of war, the arms race is a performance, a peacock display. Diplomats work overtime, crises flare, and newspapers shout, but then the conferences begin. The concert of Europe, thought dead, mutates into a nervous modern cousin. Telegrams, telephones, midnight trains to Berlin and London keeping the lid on. And Russia? Without the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, the Tsar's regime is still a powder keg, but a slower one. The humiliations of 1905 and the tremors of reform continue into the 1910s and 20s. Strikes, peasant unrest, and an angry Duma tug at Nicholas II, until, finally, reality does what bullets did in our world. It forces change. Not a Bolshevik storm in 1917, not a Red October, but a grudging evolution into a constitutional monarchy, or a messy, prolonged struggle that births a moderate republic with deep scars. Lenin, without a shattered war economy to exploit, and without a German railcar to carry him to Petrograd, is a dangerous pamphleteer rather than a revolutionary head of state. The Soviet Union as we know it? Unlikely. Socialism spreads in Europe, yes, in parliaments and strikes, not with civil war and famine. What about the Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe? Without war to blast it apart, it limps forward. The Young Turks still push for centralization. Arab intellectuals still call for reform and autonomy. Oil, quietly discovered in Persia and soon in Mesopotamia, changes the calculus. There's pressure, there's intrigue, there's money. But there is no Sykes-Picot line drawn with a ruler across deserts, no British and French armies carving provinces into mandates. Instead, imagine a slow-motion dismantling, a loose Ottoman Confederation giving way to semi-autonomous Arab states over years, not months, shaped by railways, oil concessions, and the bargaining of local elites. The Balfour Declaration doesn't exist as we know it. Jewish migration to Ottoman Palestine continues, but under Ottoman and then regional frameworks, negotiated and fraught, not born from a war's ashes. If there's no Great War, there's also no Versailles, no reparations, no hyperinflation agony in Germany, no burning need for scapegoats. The Nazi movement as we know it never gets oxygen. The Holocaust, a singular crime of our century, does not happen in this form. That does not mean the century is kind. Prejudice remains. Pogroms still flare in Eastern Europe, but the industrial genocide that defined the darkest edge of modernity, that horror is not written this way. Technology takes a different path. War is an accelerant. Without it, airplanes mature as peacetime inventions, slower, safer, more luxurious. Zeppelins don't burn their reputation into the ground in bomb raids. They become transcontinental hotels in the sky, stitching Berlin to New York and Vienna to Cairo under silver gas-filled giants with velvet dining rooms. Tanks, without trenches to solve, armored vehicles developed for colonial policing and rough terrain, not mass breakthrough. Radio still networks the planet, but code-breaking labs are not mobilized to crack Enigma. Instead, universities pace the innovation. The computer revolution begins but drifts later, gentler. No wartime Alan Turing racing a clock, more tinkering professors chasing curiosity. And the bomb? Nuclear physics still advances. Fission is discovered in 1938 whether or not there's a war. Nature's laws don't wait for politics. But without a global existential crisis, there is no Manhattan Project sprint. The first reactors arrive for power and research in the late 1940s and 50s. And when someone finally weaponizes uranium, it's with a shudder, not as the closing chord of a total war. Deterrence shows up, but later, and it sits in a world not split neatly into two superpowers, which raises the big question, who leads the century? In our world, the United States steps onto the stage after 2 world wars, cautiously at first, then decisively. Without World War I, the US stays more insular. It grows rich, is already rich, but there's no crusade to make the world safe for democracy. No League of Nations push, no Marshall Plan decades later. America still builds Hollywood and highways and Wall Street skyscrapers, but it hesitates to police the globe. Britain and France? Their empires don't bleed out in 1914-18. They remain formidable, their finances healthier, their prestige intact. Decolonization still comes, powered by ideas and demographics, but later and more negotiated. India's independence is delayed, still inevitable, still massive, but perhaps arriving as a dominion status stretched out in stages into the 1940s or 50s, negotiated with imperial governments that haven't been broken by war debt. Africa unravels from empire more slowly with different borders, different bargains, different tragedies. Germany becomes the industrial heart of the continent, not a pariah. By the 1920s and 30s, it's exporting cars and chemicals and alluring culture, pulling Eastern Europe into a German economic orbit, not with tanks, but with trade. The Kaiser remains a symbol, the technocrats run the show. Berlin is loud, decadent, brilliant. Without the trauma of defeat, German democracy may not fully blossom, but nor does it die screaming. It muddles through in a semi-constitutional haze that Europeans recognize all too well. In China, the Qing dynasty has already fallen by 1912, leaving a republic struggling to stand. Without World War I's Versailles insult, Shandong handed to Japan, there is no May 4th movement in quite the same form. Chinese nationalism still rises, but its target is not the betrayal of the West in Paris. It's the reality of foreign powers long present on the coast and a Japanese empire that slowly tightens its grip. The Anglo-Japanese Alliance, alive into the early 1920s, carries on longer in this world. Japan keeps its navy modern and its ambitions sharp. With no global war to justify sudden grabs, expansion in East Asia becomes a chess game, not a smash. Manchuria's resources tempt, but the regional order is denser. British, German, Russian, and American capital entangled. A Pacific War may still ignite one day, but the spark must be different. Even disease changes. The 1918 flu doesn't vanish from history. Influenzas don't care about treaties. But without the world's armies rotating millions of men through tightly packed barracks and ships, the pandemic spread is slower, less synchronized, perhaps less lethal. Public health advances in the 1920s still happen. Vaccines, sanitation, modern hospitals. But the urgency is different, and the scars are smaller. This gentler path has a cost. War destroys, but it also shocks societies into transformation. Women earned political power, in part, by doing everything during the war. Without that shock, suffrage and workplace equality still arrive. But later, with more speeches and fewer factories discovering that the sky doesn't fall when women run them. The cultural revolutions of the 1920s are still roaring, fueled by jazz and film and electricity, but they're less defiant, more leisurely. Economic booms and busts still thrum. The Great Depression as we know it, was it inevitable? Maybe not inevitable, but global capitalism was already skating on thin ice in the late 1920s. Without war debts and reparations grinding Germany and France, the gold standard might hold a little longer or break more cleanly. A severe downturn still hits, but it's spread differently, cushioned by empires with more liquidity, less panic, and perhaps more coordination. The United States still stumbles. The New Deal still arrives in some form. But the shock waves reaching Berlin and Vienna are less devastating. Extremist movements feed on hunger. Feed them less, and they stay smaller. By the mid-century mark, imagine the map. In Europe, 5 heavyweights: Britain, France, Germany, a reformed Danubian Federation in Central Europe, and a post-autocratic Russia pivoting between cautious modernization and old ghosts. On the map's southeastern rim, an Ottoman-derived confederation has shed some provinces but kept a center, a kind of Turkish-Arab commonwealth bound by pipelines and railways. Across the Atlantic, the US looks inward, culturally omnipresent, militarily restrained. Latin America works toward regional blocs without the same fears of superpower puppetry. The world is multipolar, crowded with flags that survived, institutions that adapted, and grievances that never got the purgative, if catastrophic release of a total war. Is that safer? Strangely, maybe. Or maybe not. Because here's the twist. By avoiding a colossal war early, tensions don't vanish. They spread across decades. The 1930s could bring a crisis in the North Sea, a naval collision between German and British ships that spirals, or a border war between Russia and Japan in the Far East turns hot, or a colonial revolt sets fire to an entire region, forcing one empire after another into a tangled intervention. The world doesn't explode, it simmers. The century becomes a long crisis management exercise. And then somewhere around the 1950s, a demonstration lights the sky. A nuclear test flashes in a desert. Not as the end of a world war, but as the end of innocence. The bomb arrives into a world with 5 anxious great powers. There is no neat Cold War, no Iron Curtain. There are many curtains, many cold fronts, and a club of nations staring at each other through a new kind of fog. Midway through this alternate century, a question lands in our lap. Would a world without World War I be more peaceful, or just differently dangerous? I want to hear your take, especially on the Danubian Federation idea. Would Franz Ferdinand's reforms hold or crack under nationalist pressure? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into the road not taken, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss the next timeline twist. Let's glance at culture before we close. Without 2 total wars, modern art still revolts, but its mood shifts. Dada emerges perhaps, but with more wit and less trauma. Futurism worships machines without tasting mustard gas. The literature of disillusionment, remarks quiet on the Western Front, doesn't exist. In its place, a chorus of novels about cities and families and the steady drama of change. Cinema still rises, Hollywood still dazzles, Berlin and Paris still invent the avant-garde. The darkness is there, human nature didn't reboot, but the themes tilt. Meanwhile, science steps with a different rhythm. Without radar rushes and cryptography races, mathematics builds its towers more slowly, logically, perhaps more transparently. Rockets? No V2, no Peenemünde. The rocket men of Germany still dream, but now they sell airmail, weather balloons, and bragging rights to wealthy patrons. Space comes later, not in the 1960s but in the 1970s or 80s, launched by a civilian consortium, a European vehicle named for a poet perhaps, rising over the Atlantic to measure the ozone and photograph the Nile's slow green curve. The first human beyond Earth orbits under many flags, not just two. And one last ripple, maybe the deepest, identity. Without both world wars, national identities in Europe don't fracture and harden in quite the same ways. The idea of Europe as a shared project, common markets, open borders, still appears, but driven less by never-again trauma and more by a quieter arithmetic of trade and trains. It's slower, harder, and more fragile. So would no World War I mean no World War II? Almost certainly. Would it mean no wars at all? Of course not. It means a 20th century that is longer, less dramatic in climaxes, more uncertain in moral lessons. There is no single roaring pivot, no Somme, no Normandy, no Berlin Wall to photograph when it falls. There are many smaller pivots, many cautious handshakes at stations, many unglamorous treaties that prevent headlines. A century of drift rather than thunder. And yet the fragility remains. In both worlds, our world and this imagined one, history balances on tiny edges, a driver's turn in a crowded city, a hand that shakes or steadies, a telegram delayed or delivered on time. The fact that so much could have hinged on one morning in Sarajevo is the unsettling truth. The Great War didn't have to happen the way it did, but once it did, it rewrote everything. Maybe the real lesson of our thought experiment is this: progress doesn't always grow from catastrophe, and catastrophe isn't destiny. We're the authors more often than we admit. If one bullet can reshape a century, how many small choices shape ours right now? When we imagine a world without World War I, we're not escaping history. We're learning how thin the ice has always been. And if we had, somehow, stepped lightly in 1914, then the lamps of Europe might have flickered, but they wouldn't have gone out. They would have burned through a different night, longer, quieter, full of its own shadows, and we would have woken to a different dawn, blinking at a world familiar in outline, startling in detail, and forever reminding us how close we came to a century that never had to be.